Welcome, everyone, to the very final episode in our series on the 10 most important battles of the Civil War. We left the battlefields of the Civil War a few episodes ago to focus on the aftermath. We looked at where all these different figures ended up once the war ended. We looked at the naval battles of the Civil War. In this final episode, we're going to look at the final effects of the Civil War, all the changes it causes on American society in the political, social, and technological realms. But before we get into those particular things, something that James and I want to discuss is a theme that we've touched on various times throughout the series, and that is the memory of the Civil War. We said that the oft-repeated but false phrase, history is written by the victors. Well, it's not really, because that's not the case in the Civil War. There are ideas about it that still linger on, and we want to look at what those ideas are, how they came about, and for the most part, why we don't believe they're true. So there's a term called the myth of the lost cause that is the early narrative of the Civil War, and I'll just briefly describe what it is, and then maybe, James, you can jump in and say, how did this narrative get constructed by the veterans of the Civil War, and why did it persist for so long? So there's one description of the myth of the lost cause that this comes from the National Register of Historic Places, which is interesting, but I think they do a good job of bringing the summary, and it's this. This is the narrative that develops after the Civil War by Southerners to explain how they lost. And it has its roots in Southern search for justification and a need to find a substitute for victory in the Civil War. So there's an image that's created of the war as a heroic epic between two sides, and one civilization is inferior to the other. So the North, which is struggling with nature and industrializing, had become materialistic and grasping for wealth and power. And the South had a genteel, chivalrous society based on honor, chastity, and fidelity in women. And the Southerners waged a noble struggle, but a doomed struggle to persevere and preserve their superior civilization. So it's this sort of chivalric battle for a lost age, and then it's completely wrecked when the economy of the South disappears. And then over time, Southerners glorify it and celebrate it. And as this myth is constructed, the lost cause myth, many of these early historians ignore declarations of secession by seceding states that focus on slavery, and they would argue that, well, it wasn't about slavery that we seceded from the Union. It had to do with states' rights as originally envisioned in the Constitution. So wartime speeches and writings, like the Cornerstone speech, that talk about slavery as a cornerstone of the Southern economy are minimized, and supporters would stress the idea of secession as a defense against the Northern threat to their way of life. So they believed any state had the right to secede, a point denied by the North. So this is how this narrative is constructed in the early years and decades following the Civil War. But yeah, James, how do you see this myth being constructed and then pushed over the years following the Civil War?
One important thing that we need to keep in mind is that the South considered itself to be superior to the North in many ways. Better culture, better, we talked very early in our series about how Southerners all said, well, one Southern boy can whip 10 Yankees. We're better fighters. We're more manly men. We're tougher. And they had to figure out a way to explain the fact that if that's the case, then how did we lose? If we're so much better, why didn't we win? And there's also a divine aspect to it. Both sides really felt like God was on their side, but the South especially did. And so they came up with these ways that they couldn't admit. They couldn't just say, well, they were better than us, because that wasn't something they were willing to concede. They were better at fighting. They were better at organizing. They were better with logistics. So they had to come up with other explanations like, well, we would have won if we had equal numbers.
Yeah.
And maybe they would have. I don't know. If we had had more industrial capacity, some people argued, and then others pointed to kind of almost like a stab in the back theory, like the Germans came up with after World War One. The idea that, well, we had certain people in our system that undermined our system, like the speculators. They were always pointing at speculators who put their own personal financial gain ahead of the Confederate war effort and things like that. They never could name anybody by name, but the idea is that if we had had equal resources, we would have easily defeated the North, because it comes down to we are better, we're superior, and we still are superior. They also pointed to things like some of our commanders, like Pemberton was demonized, and Pemberton, the
Vicksburg,
commander of Vicksburg, Pemberton should have fought harder. He shouldn't have surrendered. We lost 30,000 men there. A lot of people also pointed to Longstreet. We talked about Longstreet quite a bit in our series, and especially we talked about him and his after-war career in our epilogue episode. But Longstreet, they said, well, he this is a phrase my dad used to always use. He dogged it during Gettysburg. He didn't give it his best effort. He didn't even start the attack on day 2 of Gettysburg until the afternoon. If he had done what he was supposed to, if he had done what the brilliant and saintly General Lee had told him to promptly and correctly, then we would have won the battle. So it's to me, it's self-justification through fault finding. Okay, it's not our fault that we lost. It's just the fault of people like Longstreet and Pemberton, or the speculators, or people like George Thomas, who went and fought for the North, even though he was from Virginia. It's the fault of things we had no control over, like the different capacity of industrialization and the different population levels and everything like that. It's essentially one giant effort to say it wasn't our fault.
Yeah, I mean, they'll point to the massive quantitative superiority of the Yankee industrial machine, that yes, they won, but they, through resources and through human life in a completely without any consideration to human life, the way that the Red Army would in World War II. This is the Southern view I'm describing for why the Yankees won. And something that historians are typically aware of is when you look at historiography, when you look at how the history of a subject changes over time, you can almost always point to contemporary events shading and coloring events then. So, for an example, environmental history really grows in the 1990s with awareness of global warming. That doesn't make that branch of history incorrect at all, but it just shows that with contemporary awareness of the subject, that also affects how history is studied. With the myth of the lost cause, a lot of it's being written in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when Jim Crow descends on the South, and for legitimation of why these Jim Crow laws exist, that also colors how the Civil War and the antebellum period itself is looked at. So on another element is that you describe slavery as overall a benevolent institution where slaves are treated well, because after the war is over and they're freedmen who are in total poverty, those argue that they were better off in slavery than that situation. So the South is wrecked. And besides that, slavery was on the decline anyway, so slavery would have gone through a sunset no matter what. And then the South could have evolved into a post-slavery society where it would have been better off without having to go through a bloody, needless war led by the Butcher Grant, who was a drunkard and caused a complete and total loss of life. Now, this history, it's not handled that black and white by everyone, but that's the general coloring of it. And even up till now, there's still a lot of revisionist history that's showing that Grant was far more capable than we recognize. James mentioned in the previous episode all the biographies on Grant. Longstreet is being considered differently. Robert E. Lee, I mean, I don't think you can take away that he was a very effective military commander and strategist and did very well with the challenges that he was up against, but not this sainted figure that we understand him today. But anything else you think I'm missing with that discussion of the lost cause myth, James?
Oh, I just want to piggyback on what you said. It's very much still active today. I mean, it's a great minority, but I've had discussions or debates, if you will, with people on my Facebook site, which is called American History Fanatics, by the way, everybody. Check it out. But on American History Fanatics, I've had people tell me that Lincoln should have left. And I know I've had friends that have said this. Lincoln should have left the South alone, let him go. Like you mentioned earlier, they said, well, slavery would have eventually died out, maybe by 1900, 1910, 1920. Well, tell that to the people that would have been slaves during all that time. I mean, that may seem like an acceptable option for somebody living in the 21st century, but especially someone who's white. But if you're one of the people that would have been one of the slaves, then you were very thankful that Lincoln did what he did.
Yeah, and I have a big multi-part series on slavery, and I'll just mention one thing, that after emancipation and slaves are free, newspapers are flooded with classified ads of former slaves looking for family members, because family were frequently split apart when one family member was sold to another plantation. Up until World War I, you have newspapers where people are posting to try to find family members that were split apart. So yeah, this it dies a very, very long death of the institution of slavery. Okay, well, let's just jump in and point out some of these effects of the Civil War that happen and the long-standing effects that it has in American life. So the first thing I want to look at is the political change and the political effects of the Civil War. One of the first things is that the American government becomes more centralized. The old decentralized republic this is before the war, in which the federal government had few direct contacts with the average citizen, except really the post office. Now it becomes a nation that taxes people directly. You have an internal revenue bureau to collect taxes. Men are drafted into the army. Federal courts are more powerful. There's a national banking system. $3 billion of personal property was confiscated by emancipating the 4 million slaves. And just look at the Constitution to think about the change that happens. 11 of the first 12 amendments to the Constitution limit the powers of the national government. But after the Civil War, 6 of the next 7, beginning with the 13th Amendment in 1865, vastly increase national powers at the expense of the states. And there's debates on whether that's good or not today, definitely. These new constitutional amendments increase American power. So just to give you an idea of this, the first 3 of these post-war amendments accomplished the most radical and rapid social and political change in American history. You have the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment, the granting of equal citizenship with the 14th, voting rights in the 15th Amendment to former slaves. And this is all within a period of 5 years. Very rapid change. So 4 million slaves, there's a question of what legal rights will they have? Will they be like women who have most of the rights as men, but they don't have voting rights? How will it work? This is the central issue of the 12-year Reconstruction period after the Civil War, during which the promise of equal rights is fulfilled for a period, and then it's abandoned, and it really takes about a century for things to be completely locked into place, for at least on an formal level. I'm not talking about the informal level too, which is a whole other discussion. Another change is that the center of gravity of political power moves from the South to the North after the Civil War. So Northerners hold more power than Southerners. So the Civil War tipped the sectional balance of power in favor of the North. From the Revolutionary War, from the adoption of the Constitution in 1789 until 1861, slaveholders from states that joined the Confederacy served as presidents of the United States during 49 of the 72 years. This is 2/3 of America's history up to the Civil War. 23 of the 36 speakers of the House and 24 of the presidents pro tem of the Senate had been Southerners, and the Supreme Court had always been a Southern majority before the Civil War. But after the war, a century passed before a resident of an ex-Confederate state was elected president. So for half a century, only one of the speakers of the House and no presidents pro tem of the Senate came from the South. And very few of the Supreme Court justices during that half century were Southerners. So very much the scale tilts toward the North much. And then lastly, James and I talked about the unresolved contradictions of America after the constitutional period, but up to the Civil War, that had never been resolved. But these issues are resolved after the Civil War. The first was a question of whether this new republic would be, which is born into a world of kings and emperors and tyrants, how could it survive when a republican form of government is not the norm by any means? It was really an experiment in government in 1776. And the founding fathers feared if America would actually survive. And they knew that most republics throughout history, look in ancient Greece or Rome, were overthrown by revolutions or collapsed into anarchy or dictatorship. And many Northerners feared that this would happen with the Civil War. Some Americans that were alive in 1860 had twice seen French republics fall to these forces, and they thought the same could happen to them. So this is why Lincoln at Gettysburg described the war as the great testing of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people would survive or perish from the earth. And the Civil War showed that it could. So that's really good. The second unresolved issue from the Revolutionary era was slavery. Jefferson, I think, described slavery as holding a wolf by the ears. You do not like to do it, but you dare not stop for 1 second, lest you be ripped apart. And the founding fathers, many of them wanted to resolve this issue, but they knew that with getting the southern states on board, it was impossible. Well, this is finally resolved. So Lincoln speaks of a new birth of freedom, and he refers to this problem unresolved by the Revolution of 1776. Antebellum America had been fond of boasting that their land of liberty is a beacon of light, but for 4 million people, it was not a beacon of light. It was monstrous injustice, as Lincoln describes it. But with all of these constitutional amendments, it at least legally tries to destroy this monster, but it takes a very long time afterwards to cause it to come to an end. All right. So, any thoughts on political changes?
Yeah, a few things on the government becoming more centralized. That's certainly true. One of the things that people often quote, I see this or read this or hear it in lectures, is that prior to the Civil War, people spoke of the United States in the plural, meaning they would say the United States are an amazing people, or the United States are increasing their industrial production. Whereas after the Civil War, it changed to is, and that's a huge change. It's just a minor little linguistic thing, maybe in some people's eyes, but it speaks a lot. After the war, the United States is increasing the size of its army, or something like that. So that's one thing that's, I think, is very telling and significant. So I agree with you completely about the political power, Scott, between Northerners and Southerners. It's just amazing how much the United States government was under the control of Southerners for the first, I don't know, what is it, 1788 to 1861 or so, about 72 years or so. And not only that, but a lot of the Northern presidents were dough faces. They were completely bought and paid for by the South. I shouldn't say bought and paid for, but ideologically they were definitely on the South side. And then after the war, it's a complete flip-flop. I would just point out that you did have one Southern president between Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson, that 100 years or so that you mentioned. It was Woodrow Wilson, although, I mean, yes, he was. Right. Yeah, Wilson was governor of New Jersey, and he was the president of Princeton University, but he grew up in the South and lived there most of his childhood and his teen years, at least. And so he was very much a Southerner in his outlook. He actually segregated the White House and the executive branch, whereas it had been more or less integrated before that. So Wilson's an exception to the rule. But yeah, and it's interesting too to notice that since Lyndon Johnson, we've had quite a few Southern presidents. It's like the balance is tipping back, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it was just a phase, but we had Lyndon Johnson, of course. We had Jimmy Carter. We had the first George Bush, even though he wasn't born in the South. He lived most of his adult life in Texas, and And then George W. Bush grew up in Texas, and he's mostly a lifelong Texas, even though he has New England roots. And then you had Bill Clinton as well. So I don't know if we're tipping back. Our last two presidents have been Northerners, so who knows what's going on nowadays. But anyway, it's that shift was so radical of power from south to north. It's just almost mind-boggling to think of, but not surprising when you consider that the South lost the war. Mm-hmm. One other thing that the Civil War settled that I would add to the excellent points that you brought up is that it settled the issue of secession. Secession, when most Americans think about secession, they think about the South and the Civil War, but there had actually been several times prior to that, going all the way back to the beginning of the American Republic, where one state or one region had threatened to secede. The South had threatened a few times, but even the North had threatened to secede in individual states. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was my first job out of college, I was working in South Carolina, just an hour north of Charleston, and I was super into the Civil War at that time. And in my office, I had this replica of that Charleston Mercury headline that said that the Union is dissolved, and I put that on my wall just for fun. And in this office where I worked, I was an engineer. Most of the engineers in the office were native South Carolinians or other Southerners, but we had quite a few people from Maine there too who had moved down, and they moved from a paper mill in Maine, and they were working there, and then they intended to retire in South Carolina. And I had one guy come up to me and say, "You know what? You might want to take that sign down. You might offend some of these people from Maine." And so I went to my boss, who was from Maine, and I said, "Norm, does that offend you?" And he goes, "Oh, man, are you kidding? You don't know how many times Maine threatened to secede from the Union." I'd never even heard of that at the time, so that was kind of funny. But secession was once and for all settled. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case in 1869, Texas versus White, and in this, the court held, among other things, it was not just about this, but one of the things the court ruled was that the Constitution did not permit states to unilaterally secede from the United States, and that the ordinances of secession and all the acts of the legislatures within seceding states intended to give effect to such ordinances were absolutely null. So that settled the issue, even though when we know that you still hear a lot of talk about secession from time to time. There was talk about Texas. I mean, just talk. It's
or California, Cal exit.
And now it's California, right? But
sorry, guys, this marriage is for life. Once you're in, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Good quote. All right. So, that's all I have to add there.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
This summer, there's only one place to meet Chuck Norris, Eric Estrada, friends from Netflix's Original Wednesday, Demon Slayers, My Hero Academia, Dragon Ball Z, Adventure Time, and more. It's not Austin, not Houston, Dallas, or even San Antonio. It's right here at Bell County Comic-Con. Yeah! Our biggest star-studded event hits the Bell County Convention Center August 5th and 6th. Artists, superheroes, comic and toy exhibitors, games, cosplayers, celebrity guests, and much more in one safe place. BellCountyComicCon.com.
Autumn is the selling season at Killeen Auto Sales. Killeen Auto Sales is a family-owned business in Central Texas since 1983. Their unique inventory of cars, SUVs, and trucks is geared to fit your lifestyle and budget. They can help you get back on the road with their team of sales and finance specialists. Let Killeen Auto Sales show you why so many customers say it's the best buying experience they've ever had. Call them at 254-699-5810 or find them on the net at KilleenAutoSales.net. That's Killeen Auto Sales.
Once in a generation, a podcast comes along with the power and eloquence to inspire us all.
This show will entertain you while you wait for that one. Join two best friends, author and former history teacher John Driver and comedian Johnny W. for hilarious and authentic conversations about life, history, culture, faith, and everything in between.
You can listen to Talk About That wherever you find your podcasts or at lifeaudio.com.
One thing, too, is military change. We've mentioned a lot in this series how it seemed that people are dying needlessly because tactics cooked up by, take a drink, Napoleon, 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, are still being used ineffectively. But these are brilliant military minds who are engaged in the conflict, and of course they are going to adapt to the situation. So what changes as a result of the Civil War? The first one is that logistics dependent on modern transportation become more important than Napoleonic-style fancy maneuvers. I mean, we've talked in the early 19th century, Napoleonic maneuvers where you outflank an enemy force, you strike them on their side, you strike behind them, you move your forces quickly over land are important. But the time and space of the Civil War changes because railroads now enable swift movement of forces, of logistics. Steamboats allow this as well. I mean, yeah, you're constrained to narrow, vulnerable corridors, but you can move much more quickly. And on the sea, steam power, ironclads change transport and combat there as well. The telegraph allows rapid communication between armies and your headquarters. So it's almost like your chief of command can be there right on the front lines. So combat is still usually waged with skirmishes on rural battlefields, but there is still room for strategic maneuvers and triumphs of strategic maneuvers like Sherman's March to the Sea, which is a classic Napoleonic move. But this depends on an enemy's unwillingness to entrench. Entrenching becomes much more common as the war goes on too. And that's the second point, that entrenchment to counter long-range firearms is another feature. So towards the end of the war, especially with in defense of static targets like the battles of Cold Harbor, Vicksburg, you have trench networks that get more and more sophisticated, and they foreshadow World War I. Interestingly enough, these battles aren't immediately learned in Europe. So the Austro-Prussian War or the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, you still have these Napoleonic-style maneuvers. But in America, entrenching becomes a means to encounter long-range firearms, and commanders learn that sometimes you just have to sit on your haunches a long time because a charge isn't going to accomplish anything. You might slaughter your men unless you have another diversionary tactic. And it seems like this isn't really solved until you have aerial combat that can deal with entrenching. And then you have tanks as well that can handle these large open spaces. And warfare eventually evolves. But James and I were discussing, it seems like the Civil War, the technology to kill works, but the technology to protect you doesn't. So technology seems to be only your enemy and not your friend in the Civil War. It's miserable. And then the third point, too, is that there are advances in naval warfare with the importance of ironclads. So after putting iron plating on wooden hulls, and then you have ships that are built up specifically as ironclads, naval vessels are almost indestructible, at least compared to their wooden counterparts. And with a rotating turret, you don't need as many cannon on a single vessel because you don't have to move an entire ship in order to fire on your enemy. So you can keep firing on a retreating or advancing craft when you're on the move. And then there's just some miscellaneous technology, too, I'll throw in. We mentioned dog tags because in the past, soldiers would write letters or whatever, put them in their pocket. So if they were killed on the battlefield, people knew who they were. But that becomes part of it as well. Okay, and then just a couple of other things with military technology. You have the importance of a nation's size and productivity is better appreciated. As we're moving into the thick of an industrial age, total industrial output is seen as what can ultimately win a war, not how well you outflank an enemy on the field. Your total industrial war effort of being able to adequately supply your troops, when you're dealing on the scale of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and understanding the importance of your military machine is better appreciated. In World War I, World War II, we see this in terms of strategy, where taking out a factory becomes equally as important as taking out actual soldiers, because if you can't feed or equip them, who cares? This is not the Revolutionary War where a bunch of hard-scrabble rebels can basically live off the land. I mean, those days are, except for limited periods of time, like the Sherman's March to the Sea, for a few weeks at a time, you can do that, but not for the long haul. Those days are gone, definitely. Also, controlling the seas is understood to be more important than fortifying the coast. So what I mean is that there's one strategist, one American strategist by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan. He almost single-handedly brings the field of naval strategy up to date after the Civil War. So he saw that economic strategy could be just as important as military strategy. And with the blockade of the Confederacy, we see that controlling the sea grants the power to control trade, and it controls the resources needed to wage war. So Mahan pushes the concept of the big navy, where defense is achieved by controlling the seas instead of fortifying the coasts. And these theories contribute to naval arms races that you see at the end of the 19th century. So any other thoughts on the changes of the military after the Civil War?
I think you covered it very well there. But yeah, definitely on the tactics and the way that the armies marched. If you watch, again, here we go with movies. I got to work a movie into every episode. It's a rule. But if you watch movies like Gettysburg and like Glory, where you see the Civil War, or even documentary or reenactors, you see how the lines of men are just all like jammed together. People are marching shoulder to shoulder, and when they march along, like when they're marching from one place to another, they're marching in a column of four across. And then when they get into battle formation, there's usually two lines, one in front and one behind. They're all just jammed together. That goes away. When you watch, like I just got through watching the Ken Burns series on World War II called The War, which is very good too. And when you see those soldiers going into combat, you see them, they're often running or at least walking quickly. They're spread out. They figured out after this war that it's not a good idea to have it to where one cannonball can take out 20 guys, right? But yes, so it's definitely tactics are going to change, although they don't change everywhere. We see in World War I, you still see a lot of frontal assaults against entrenched positions. It's almost like Europe doesn't learn the lesson of the Civil War. Entrenchment, like you said, is extremely important. We mentioned earlier that you get these over time. You develop these really elaborate networks of trenches. And as ironclads, that's definitely a major issue. Wooden ships are going to be pretty much gone within a decade or two. And yeah, all these changes, huge military changes that come out of the Civil War for sure.
Then in terms of technology, the changes that happen are also very important. The first have to do with medicine and healthcare. We talked about how horrific it must be because in the Civil War, if you get hit by a mini ball, which tears up the flesh, oftentimes the recourse is amputation. And the technology to kill had advanced, the technology to heal had not. It's almost like the Civil War, it's the last gasp of the Middle Ages, where on each side when the war begins, you have puny squads of physicians. Maybe they were trained by a textbook, maybe they weren't. But after 4 years, when you have so many casualties, hundreds of thousands of casualties of war, you have legions of field-tested doctors who have studied anatomy, understand surgical practice, anesthesia, and they're still dealing with crude weapons, but when they amputate, it's not as though they just have a crude hacksaw. They do have saws, but they're remarkably precise how well they can conduct these procedures. They typically have ether or other whatever they could use to knock people out. The nation's first ambulance corps is developed here to rush wounded soldiers to battlefront hospitals. So you're not just leaving men on the field for days. Using wagons and deployed for that purpose are developed during the Civil War. So you collect wounded soldiers from the field, take them to a dressing station, and transport them to the field hospital. Doctors also change how these field hospitals are organized. They lay out these hospitals as camps, and they're divided into different wards, such as surgery and convalescence. So you have medical staff who are trained to perform different duties. And women flock to serve these hospitals as nurses as well, which also has long-term social changes with women entering the healthcare fields. Also, with the massive growth of hospitals and how they're organized, before the war, most people receive health care at home. After the war, hospitals adapt from the battlefront model, and this crops up all over the country. So you do have some famous figures before the war, like Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War. And you mentioned the name of this woman. I forget it in the Civil War. She's famous as a nurse. What's her name, James?
Clara Barton.
Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, she goes on to found the American Red Cross later. Yeah.
Yeah, so sadly, America has a lot of experience with how to deal with combat wounds at this period, and thankfully it applies these lessons to future issues. So you just don't have the hell. I can't imagine how hellish it would look to see thousands of men on a battlefield dying of wounds, seeing sepsis come in, but they're reforming that for the next war, which is good. Technological change. I won't mention much about military technology. I mean, we've mentioned ironclads and repeating rifles, which is another step in evolution from the rifled musket, far faster in reloading speed than muzzle loaders. In terms of other miscellaneous technology, I mentioned dog tags. So if you're killed on the field, people know who you are because there's so many people who die on the field. Hot air balloons for aerial reconnaissance. This appears in the Civil War, too. Wouldn't be one of those if they're shot out. Landmines appear as well. Explosive technology is becoming quickly miniaturized.
Let me jump in. In real quick, if I could, on the rifles. Don't forget about the machine guns too. Machine guns make their debut with the Gatling gun. Although they didn't play a huge role in the war. They were barely even used at all. But they obviously are going to have a big future and a huge impact on warfare going forward.
Right. That's for World War I. In the Civil War, you saw how deadly it is to do a charge. In World War I, it is absolutely suicidal. But there's not much else you can do. So you're either sitting on your haunches for a long time in the trench or charging, and we'll see. The big one is telegraphs. I'm a scholar of the 19th century. I hate to use that term. It sounds so pompous, but people just cannot appreciate how shocking the telegraph is. This is the first time in humanity where instantaneous communication is possible. Before that, you'd have, I guess, carrier pigeons. And there are innovative techniques in the Byzantine Empire, you have signals using fire, like what you would see in the Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, where the message is the call for help quickly goes from Gondor to Rohan. So you have primitive versions of that, but a telegraph, it's shocking. You can instantly communicate over long distances. You can almost communicate in real time. It's text messaging. Okay, it's clunky, but it's as long as you have a trained telegraph operator there communicating in Morse code, it is no slower than text messaging. So there is a cataclysmic break between before telegraph, BT, and AT after telegraph.
Yeah.
So you have real-time communication about battle results, enemy troop movements, unit locations. You can manage a war from the chief of staff in a way that was unfathomable throughout all of human history until then. Lincoln uses the telegraph daily. He spends long nights waiting for news from the front. He wants to know exactly what is happening so he can issue orders to commanders. As soon as armies arrive at any location, they set up telegraph lines. Civil War soldiers grew adept at putting up telegraph lines since they did it so frequently. In conjunction with telegraphs, the Union military also uses observation balloons to watch battles, monitor enemy troop movements. These movements are then relayed to ground commanders who then adjust their own troop movements accordingly or telegraph back to headquarters what they had witnessed. So telegraphs are a big deal. And then the last one I'll mention is food. Canning technology happens. Now, it doesn't debut at the Civil War. Napoleon is credited as being the first person to use canned food to feed his army. I don't know how accurate this is. And it's not perfected at this point. Well, throughout the 19th century, you have issues where food is not properly canned and food spoils or men get sick from eating spoiled food. But from the generals like McClellan, who might be poor as battlefield tacticians but are expert at logistics, having canned food and feeding your army and transporting it over a long distance, again, to them would be as revolutionary as the telegraph, being able to provision your men. So today we have MREs, much fancier than the hardtack or the what the other food you talked about, James, in the previous episode. So it's not as easy. You can't just whip out your can opener or your Swiss Army knife to pop it open. They're difficult to open, they're heavy, but still you have portable food. So that's some of the technology that debuts in the Civil War. Any other thoughts on those things?
No, that's excellent summary of a lot of change, just a tremendous amount of technological change, and people don't normally think about technology when they think of the Civil War.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Once in a generation, a podcast comes along with the power and eloquence to inspire us all.
This show will entertain you while you wait for that one. Join two best friends, author and former history teacher John Driver and comedian Johnny W. for hilarious and authentic conversations about life, history, culture, faith, and everything in between.
You can listen to Talk About That wherever you find your podcasts or at lifeaudio.com.
They were some of the most powerful men who've ever lived. They waged war, forged peace, and altered the fates of billions of people. And yet, they were just as human, just as flawed as you and me. They were the presidents of the United States, and they are the subjects of the history podcast, This American President. In each episode of This American President, we explore how flawed men have managed this awesome responsibility. To listen now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search This American President on your favorite podcast platform.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
Well, the last thing we want to talk about is social change. And if there's anything where the Civil War is still being fought, that's the issue today. And we started this episode with the whole historiographical debate that's still going on. Now, the first one is the most obvious. The Civil War ends slavery. I'm not going to say a lot on that because that's something that if people know about, they know about Reconstruction, they know about the after effects. So I don't want to get into that too much, but just for a couple of the bullet points with it, 4 million slaves are freed. This is a loss of $3.5 billion of capital in the South that is now completely worthless. The economic backbone of the South is built on slavery. Buying a slave is very expensive. Now that money is gone, and it makes the plantation system collapse. So great, enormous estates are divided into tenant farms that are rented to sharecroppers. So there's a form of exploitation that continues in sharecropping, but it doesn't funnel money the way that it used to with slavery. So emancipation, it severs the South from the institution that some would think it shaped its thoughts and its habits and the daily lives of both races. And in my series on slavery, I quoted a section from Booker T. Washington. Highly recommend his biography. But he grew up as a slave, and he talked about how there was a feeling of euphoria among slaves as when the days of emancipation came closer, and a Union soldier comes to the plantation where he is and reads the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's celebrating all night long, but then the next day people ask, well, what now? I mean, my way of life is gone and I don't want to be a slave, but what on earth do I do? So for the new freedmen, post-war life is, really in the South, it's a nightmare. You're made a scapegoat by white Southerners who are angry with all that's happened to them. You have black codes, which is the emergence of Jim Crow. You're terrorized by hooded vigilantes at night. You know that you simply do not go into certain towns after dark if you don't want to be lynched. So that is something that is a legacy that does not end after a while. Okay, so other social changes. The United States went to war in 1861 to preserve a union. It emerged from the war in 1865, having created a nation. James mentioned earlier that the United States was used in the plural. The United States are. Now you say the United States is. And that's only a matter of grammar in the beginning, but it has important impact from how people conceptualize the United States. So the loose union of states became a single nation. And Lincoln's wartime speeches marked this transition. In his first inaugural address, he refers to the Union 20 times, but the nation not even once. But in his first message to Congress on July 4th, 1861, he uses the word Union 32 times and the nation 3 times. But by the Gettysburg Address, he didn't mention the Union at all, but spoke of the nation 5 times to talk about a new birth of freedom and nationhood. So just as an aside, a lot of the collective memory we have of the United States, of what it is, when we think about it as a nation, when we think about the symbology of America with American flags, a lot of this, some of it was there at the beginning of the nation, but a lot of it appears after the Civil War. If you read the Little House on the Prairie books that take place in the 1880s, where in Ma and Pa Ingalls' house, there's a picture of George Washington there. And part of this is an attempt to try to, there are attempts to foster sort of a shared ethos of the United States amongst all people, and the idea of the United States nation. So being a nationalist is something that becomes much stronger after the Civil War. And I mean, James, you're from Texas, and if there's any state in America that I'd argue has a really strong state identity, it's Texas. But to talk about being a Texan first and American second, I'm not Texan, but that would almost seem like a joke. I mean, people say that, but it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. Don't mess with Texas. But have you ever actually met anyone who would almost consider themselves Texas first, America second?
Oh, I've met several people like that. There's quite a few, but they would be the minority for sure. Most people I know in Texas consider themselves Americans first and Texans second. I mean, I certainly do.
Right, and it's there, but it's on the fringe. But before the Civil War, that's probably a lot of people, especially in the South. I mean, Robert E. Lee fighting for Virginia because of his state. Your identity by your state was very strong, but it reduces significantly with your identity as American.
Oh, absolutely. The overwhelming majority of Americans at the time of the Civil War had never left their state. A lot of them had never even left their own town, to be honest with you. But yeah, people identified first as I'm a Virginian, or I'm a Pennsylvanian, or I'm a New Yorker, or whatever. But after the war, there's definitely develops more of an American identity.
Right. There's a concept that historians use called invented tradition, where in any state, creating its own national mythology will speak as if these values and these traditions, which we have now, have gone back to this mythological past. So the Turkish people are geniuses at this, talking about a Turkish identity that goes back 2,000 years to primordial Central Asia. Mm-hmm. But Americans were guilty of this too, where we imagine that what it means to be American and how we understand American identity to be. Does some of it trace back to after the Revolutionary War? Maybe you can argue yes, but a lot of it comes out after the Civil War, and a whole lot of it comes out after World War II. Many of the institutions and traditions we have are post-World War II identities. So I'm not being this too cool for school revisionist historian that say, hey, you rubes, you're dumb. I'm not being that guy. I don't like that guy. I've met that guy. And let me just say he's no fun. But just to understand that a lot of the traditions we have come about after this, something to understand, because of how much the Civil War changes the configuration of America. And a big reason is that because of the enormous loss of life and how much this causes a tectonic shift in America just in terms of demographics. So there are 620,000 soldiers that lose their lives in the war, which is by far the deadliest war that America has ever fought in. This is 2% of the population in 1861. So just to give you an idea of how big this is, if the same percentage of Americans were to be killed in a war fought today, this would exceed 6 million who had died That's about Holocaust numbers right there. So the number of casualties suffered in a single day at the Battle of Antietam in 1862 was 4 times the number of Americans killed and wounded at the Normandy beach landings on D-Day on June 6, 1944. So enormous loss of life. One other factor, too, the social change, is that America becomes more focused on its industrial path than its agrarian path. Some wonder that if the Confederacy would have won, or if the agrarian pathway that the Confederacy is following, where it's focused on these landed estates and the yeomanry, as Jefferson talked about, if this would have won out, could have America have developed more like a Russian model than a Germany or an England that's industrializing? So before 1861, there were 2 socioeconomic and cultural systems that competed for dominance within the United States. There's an agricultural social order based on slavery versus a capitalist entrepreneurial society based on free labor. So we can say that in retrospect, free labor couldn't have helped but have won. That wasn't the clearest path in the antebellum era, and much of the South was much richer than the North. The institutions and ideologies of the agricultural plantation and the capitalistic system, the Southern system with its caste system based on race and slavery, it dominated the U.S. government during much of the early Americas. But the territory of the slave states considerably exceeded that of the free states, and the Southern drive for further expansion, it seemed a lot more aggressive than that of the North and the competition to add free states and slave states before the Civil War.
Oh,
So,
definitely. Southerners were trying to go down and take over parts of Mexico, parts of Central America with the filibusters. The Cuba, the Southern desire for more land was just insatiable. You don't see that in the North, really, at least not much.
And there's all sorts of counterfactual history of if the Confederacy would have won, if they would have at least remained their own nation, the United States might not have emerged as the world's largest economy and foremost democracy by the late 19th century, because they wouldn't be this industrial power in the same way. Maybe like a Russia, I don't know. So,
yeah, let me piggyback on
Yeah.
that for a minute. There from the very beginning of American history, there was always a tension between agrarianism and the Southern culture and the Southern economy and way of life, and the Northern, more industrial way of life. It goes back almost the very beginning of English colonial settlement, to some degree anyway, the 2 different cultures. But I often think about the Jefferson and Hamilton debate. Hamilton, this is when it really was stated explicitly, where each side was arguing for the superiority of their ideas. Hamilton wanted a nation built on banking and commerce and manufacturing industry, not so heavily based on agriculture, and not ruled by an elite. Whereas Jefferson wanted a nation of small farmers. Jefferson, in some ways, was anti-elitist as well, but he was kind of an elite himself. So I think there was a tension in his own thinking on that. He was definitely not in favor of the democracy of the masses, as a lot of people are today, and most Americans are. But Jefferson wanted an economy based on agriculture, farming, small farms as well as plantations. Jefferson didn't like banks. Jefferson didn't like big cities. Jefferson didn't like manufacturing that much. And so that tension, that debate between the Jeffersonians, if you will, and the Hamiltonians persisted all the way into the Civil War. And the Civil War finally settled it. I guess because of the Union victory, it was declared by default that the Union is going to be, or the United States is going to be a Hamiltonian kind of country. It's going to be a nation where the central government is more powerful than the state governments. It's going to be a nation based on banking and manufacturing and commerce. And it's interesting. One time when I was teaching on the Jefferson-Hamilton thing, I had a student in my class who was from Africa, and he raised his hand and he said, I want to tell you something. I grew up in an African country, and I've been in other ones as well, and they were all based on agriculture. He said, you do not want your nation to base their economy entirely on agriculture. It only leads to poverty and corruption and disaster. And I thought that was really interesting because I'd never really thought of it. He brought in a very, very interesting and a different perspective that just it's like, wow, this guy thinks Hamilton was right, and he's lived in a more of a Jeffersonian kind of country, if you will. So this definitely settles what kind of nation we're going to be. Hamilton finally wins, although it doesn't happen until 60 something years after he's dead.
Right. And he has the musical, so until Jefferson gets one based on himself, then Hamilton's going to be the victor there.
That's right.
And the one last thing I want to mention is that another social change that happens as a direct result of the Civil War is that the idea of America as a land of opportunity, I'm using the term invented tradition, and I'm not using that to say that, it's fake. It doesn't mean what it says, but the ideology, and when we speak of that, has to do with policies that come out of this. I mean, yes, you have founding fathers who will speak and get into philosophical discourse on the nature of freedom and how the United States was architected to maximize individual liberties. But here are two policies that, at least in action, really propel America forward for that. One is the first transcontinental railroad. It's the world's first transcontinental line that's built between 1863 and 1869. And it was partially intended to bind California to the Union during the Civil War. So to build the line, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads were granted 400-foot rights-of-way plus 10 square miles of government-owned land for every mile of track built. So this binds America together. You can get across it. You don't have to go on wagons and go on the Santa Fe Trail or Oregon Trail or other trails. But the other factor, the second thing really feeds into this, and that's homesteading in the West. The Homestead Act in 1862, it provided that any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the U.S. government, important clause right there, could be granted 160 acres of surveyed government land after living on it. So getting your own land just by showing up, I mean, medieval Europe fought wars for wars are fought for land since the dawn of time. Now you just show up and you can get land. This is shocking to the rest of the world. This idea of opportunity. Now, part of it is... Yeah,
that's why so much of the rest of the world came over.
Exactly. So that's something that is an incredible opportunity, but it's a policy born of the period of the Civil War, where the U.S. grants that land if you have not raised arms against it. And I don't know as much about the Homestead Act. Was it so that America, the Union at least, could fill out its land with Union sympathetic people, or is that kind of the idea?
I think that's part of it, and I think that's why Southern politicians opposed it so much prior to the Civil War. There had been attempts to pass similar laws, but the Republicans weren't able to pass it until after most of the Democrats had left the Congress.
Yeah, so that causes a flood of people.
Of it, though. I mean, I think they just wanted to organize the West and promote westward expansion of white settlers in general.
All right. Well, that is social change. Before we wrap up here, do you have any other thoughts about those points on social change, James?
No, I think we've pretty much covered it, at least as much as we're going to. You could do an entire lecture series just on that, but we hit the high points, I believe.
Well, I figured it wouldn't be right if we didn't cap off this entire series with this episode with a question. And I wanted to ask this to you because you've studied the Civil War for decades. You've really thought about it. You know about the battles. You know the names behind the battles. You know the officers. But just to get a little bit more philosophical, I'm wondering if you've contemplated, what does a civil war mean? What does the war actually mean? It's two sides fighting against one another. It's the Union versus the Confederacy. But beyond the number of troop casualties, beyond the results of war, beyond the strategy, beyond the flanking maneuvers, to cap everything off, what would you say that the Civil War means?
Well, the Civil War was the central defining event of U.S. history. More than any other event in our nation's history, people often say, well, before the Civil War, but then after the Civil War, it changed so many things that it's just a watershed moment in U.S. history. Definitely more than anything else, even the American Revolution. The American Revolution settled whether or not we would be a nation. And of course, that's extremely important. There's no doubt about that. But the Civil War, as we've touched upon previously, the Civil War settled what kind of nation we will be. Are we going to be a nation of where the states are supreme and the federal government has very little power to do anything? Are we going to be a nation based upon agriculture and a caste system, as you used that term earlier? I thought that was pretty good. I like the way you used that. It was because the South did have a caste system. You had an aristocracy, not an official one, but an unofficial aristocracy of wealth. And then you had all the way at the bottom the slaves, and then you had levels in between, the poor white farmers, and then the small plantation holders and all that. Is that the country we're going to have, or are we going to have a country that's more based on, as I mentioned before, Hamilton's vision for the country? Commerce, banking, big business, for better or worse, becomes one of the key factors of the American Republic, which it had not been before the Civil War. And the government, a lot of people tell me, well, Lincoln increased the power of the government, and the war increased the power of the government. Well, every war does that. I mean, you could also say Woodrow Wilson did, Franklin Roosevelt did. Lincoln increased the power of the government, or at least, let's say, during the Civil War. I don't know that Lincoln single-handedly did it. He certainly increased the power of the presidency. But during the Civil War, the government got bigger. There's no doubt about it. The government became more powerful. But I have to say that compared to today, it was still very, very, very small. If you index, let's say, the power of and size of the United States federal government, let's say it's 100 today. Let's just put a number on it. I would say the Civil War moved it up from about a 15 to about a 20 or 25. The government in 1865 was still just a tiny fraction of what it is today. And some people would say, well, that's bad. Some would say good. That's not my point. My point is just to say that, yes, it did increase the size of the government and the power of the government, but it was just, in that regard, I don't know that it was a watershed moment so much, because we see the size and the power of government even contracts a little bit after the Civil War. So I think the fundamental, the keyness, if you will, or the importance of the Civil War is not so much in what happened to government, but I think it's, as I mentioned, the things that it did settle about the nature of the country. And I would also add, it obviously settled, even though, as we've said many times before, this wasn't the purpose at the beginning, but it did settle the key question that had dogged the American Republic since its beginning, and that was the slavery question. Now, did it solve all the problems of African Americans? Well, certainly not, and not even close. It fell very short of making their lives equal and equally enjoyable to those of white Americans. But it did at least ensure that we're not going to be a nation where we have chattel slavery, where one person can own another person and profit from that person's labor and grow wealthy, fabulously wealthy, while these other people are forced to live these miserable lives. So that's it. It changed the slavery question, and it changed the nature of the government to some degree, but it changed the nature of the nation.
Great way to cap it off. It determined what kind of nation we would be. Well, when I usually close off an episode, I like to point people to where they can go to follow up the discussion, because you can talk about the Civil War absolutely endlessly. So, James, you host the wonderful Facebook group, American History Fanatics, which is where I first came across you. So if people want to continue the Civil War debate and discussion ad infinitum, how do they find your group?
Just go into Facebook and search for American History Fanatics, and you'll find us. Now, I must warn everybody, it's a very friendly group. It's a fun group, and we keep it that way. We do not discuss politics. And so let's not go in there bringing up Confederate flags or Confederate statues or things like that, because it'll get ugly fast. And we talk about, it's not really so much a debate group as it is discussion and friendly banter back and forth. There's a playful atmosphere to the group. We talk about not just politics and battles and wars. We also talk about music history, and we talk about culture and other things like that. But it's a very fun group. So yeah, look us up and join the group. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for staying with us through this series. I'm Scott Rank.
I'm James Early.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles in the Civil War podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show in the podcast player of your choice and leave us a rating and a review. This helps us grow and reach new listeners. You can also find maps of the battle sites, show notes to each episode, and plenty of other history info by going to keybattlesinthecivilwar.com.